and I can hear myself. And we are live. We are live finally. Okay. Good afternoon, East Coast. Good morning, West Coast. Good almost evening, BST, UK time. And yeah, thank you for joining us. All none of you right now, but it's all good. Oh, 10. All right. Oh, I guess I should go to the chat comments. First of all, I want to thank everyone for here for taking time and joining me. For those who don't realize it, this is a Toronto Web Performance Meetup Group presentation. It's been quite a while between like pandemic and work being a little crazy, but I wanted to make sure that I was able to kind of reboot things as I poked around because I do want to bring this back live. But I do realize the opportunities that come with streaming and having these kind of like situations online. And like today, we're going to do what I believe we're just calling a Core Web Vitals AMA. We'll be able to talk about Core Web Vitals and specifically all that's happened in the last 3 years since it's been introduced. And in the last, we'll say year, there's been, I don't want to say a significant change, but definitely change that we want to discuss. And here to discuss said changes are three of my fave friends, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves. I'll start. Let me see. Should I go in alphabetical order? Yes, I will. A is for Annie. Annie, how are you doing? And let the people know who you are.
Hi, everybody. I'm Annie Sullivan. I am a software engineer on the Chrome web platform team at Google. I lead the speed metrics team, which develops both the Core Web Vitals metrics and also web performance APIs.
Amazing. Well, thank you for joining us, Annie. I mean, I was going to go to B, but B seems to have disappeared. So we're going to go straight to M. Michael, introduce yourself, please.
Okay, how is everyone? I'm Michal Mocny, and I'm also a software engineer on the Chrome Speed Metrics team. Annie's my tech lead. I've mostly been working on INP, or Interaction to Next Paint, over the last year or so, but I've also spent some time on smoothness and scheduling and a bunch of other stuff related in those types of areas. So quite passionate about main thread execution, that sort of thing. Also spent a lot of time working on like web frameworks and understanding the JavaScript space, especially as it relates to responsiveness and that sort of thing. So that's my wheelhouse.
Amazing. Well, thank you for joining us, Michael. Michael, fine Canadian as well, so I have to shout him out. Barry, thanks for joining us again. I'm not sure what happened there, but you missed your spot at B. So, Mr. Pollard, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I can't work computers too good. I clicked the wrong button. That was totally my fault. Hi, everyone. I'm Barry Pollard. I work in DevRel in the web performance space. So I write a lot of the docs for Core Web Vitals, which basically means I get to interrogate Annie and Michael and try and translate all their deep knowledge into something more understandable for the rest of us. So yeah, ask me any questions on that. I also look after the Chrome User Experience Report. So I do the Crux releases. You might have seen my name on that. Yeah, I've met quite a few people at conferences and stuff like that. So yeah, hit me up if you've got any questions on any of that.
Amazing. Well, thank you for all your work, Barry, and thank you for joining us, certainly. So, man, we're here to talk about Core Web Vitals. It's been 3 years. I mean, let's start with this. How do you feel the goals of the original Vitals in terms of, what, their introduction meant? Have they sort of like reached their sort of essential goals? Did you realize what the team wanted to do with these 3 Vitals, or Vitals in general, actually? Anyone?
I guess I could take it. Yeah, so I mean, I've just absolutely been overwhelmed by the Core Vitals and how far we've come from where we were 3-4 years ago. I'm just so excited about, like, we had the goal to really get the broader web ecosystem really engaged in these metrics and in specific goals, and I really felt like that has been achieved. At the same time, of course, I think we always do need to continue to evolve the Vitals, even if there's just like for example, largest contentful paint, right? That's a specific metric. The goal is faster page load times. And if things on the web evolve so that we need to evolve that metric, we would. So in there, they can never have like the goals perfectly met because the web does evolve.
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, in terms of just like being able to, I mean, you know what, Barry, I want to get your take on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I like it because it kicked off before I joined Google, so I can't take any real credit for this. So well done to the rest of the people. But I think it changed the way we talk about performance. I think it reached out to a lot more people for a start. I think it changed from sort of arcane metrics that the browser knows about and nobody really understands to user-centric metrics that I can explain to my dad and understand, like, when is the content drawn? How much is it shifting around? Is it responsive? Rather than TTFB or DCL or any of the other million acronyms we had. And then I really like the fact that it's measuring actual user experience rather than Lighthouse says this or Googlebot says that. It's really brought that to the forefront. And I think making Crux available to everyone gives people that. I think before it was kind of a niche thing, and those of us that was lucky enough to have our own product were great, but a lot of other people didn't really understand that, and they could stick stuff and get a 100 in Lighthouse and feel good about themselves, but have no idea whether that's really reflective of their user experience. Mm-hmm. I think the combination of all those things makes it a really interesting program. It wasn't just 3 new metrics; it was a change in how we actually measure user experience and web performance.
Absolutely, and I feel like it was perfect timing for me to ask Michael how he felt as well, because you mentioned you sort of are working with JavaScript execution and how that sort of relates to everything. So do you feel that the vitals came about at a time, or at a perfect time, where things were getting really complicated?
I do. I think that in some sense it was maybe even a low point for the web. I think that it was getting larger, more sophisticated, more bloated in many ways, but then a couple of very popular features layered onto each other in a way that had performance trade-offs, and it was hard to navigate those trade-offs. One example that pops to mind immediately is the idea of SSRing a client-side application, right? There are plenty of good reasons to move to an SPA model or client-side rendering, and then there are plenty of good reasons to SSR an application in order to get like SEO benefits or early loading. But to do it all at once, I think we've all followed the journey of how these things changed. And so these were all trade-offs that are hard to navigate, and we're kind of working our way out of that to not have to pay so much cost for each of those benefits, but you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. Now, I don't know if the Web Vitals motivated those changes. I think those things were understood and well underway already. On the other hand, I think it takes a long time for folks to adapt the latest and greatest changes, or to understand the value of like a large refactoring. Like, you could easily understand the cost involved in terms of the risks that it might take, or the literal price that it might pay, like cost to hire developers to do this work. But when you see your vital scores and you see like this other class of applications that did do this heavy lifting of adapting the latest and greatest and saw these wins, it's a lot more motivational. And so we see a lot of higher level management, etc., understanding the benefits of web performance. And so that was a big win. And so I think a lot of the industry professionals, I think, are able to understand the nuanced trade-offs, but having sort of a clear set of actions and then nice metrics tied to it, it's just so much easier to understand that story. So that's one of the reasons I'm quite excited about that timing of that launch, and then the effects that we've seen. We've seen this sort of race to the bottom and then a bounce back, and we've had folks like Dan Shapiro talking about this like turning around of real UX out in the wild. And again, it's hard to know how much the vitals were a direct cause, but I think it came right at that right time.
Yeah. I mean, I will have to kind of agree here. Not that I would disagree, but I do feel that there was a point where things were a little complicated, and whether or not we could qualify it as a low point, but I do think that when vitals kind of came around, I felt like that kind of opened up the door to a community of folks who used to potentially disregard performance as like, whatever, it's a little complicated, but things are fine here, et cetera, to now having a bit of a better understanding, because there wasn't this sort of, this wall of like hieroglyphs, yes, that they could just not comprehend, and they would just sort of like gloss over. So now we have like the SEO community here. We have the technical SEO community. And I know, speaking from a catch point perspective, where we have, CMOs who come around are also very curious about the vitals. Whereas I think prior to the vitals and, maybe a couple of years before that, they just did not care that much, so that's certainly good to see. Now, Barry, you'd mentioned, people sort of like getting to understand, rum a little, even though I feel like it's a little bit not off course, but, do you feel that, the rum conversation has started to sort of sink in?
I think so, to a point. We still get an awful lot of confusion, or a lot of people saying, hey, I've got 100 in Lighthouse. And I'll be honest, a lot of us are saying, no, don't look at that number. Look at the other numbers. If you type in your URL into PageSpeed Insight, the bit at the top to me is the more important. It's the real user metrics. You can sit there, you can compare it to the Lighthouse, which is more supposed to give advice. It takes longer, it runs a synthetic test. But you need to sit there and go, is this reflective of what I'm seeing, the numbers at the top there? And if it is, then great, all the advice stands. If not, then you maybe want to tweak the advice. Okay, you're showing great LCP, Lighthouse is saying your LCP sucks. Maybe you can ignore the LCP advice, because it turns out that's not a problem in real life, and concentrate on the things that are a real problem. So yeah, I think Lighthouse is great in so many ways, and I love the tool, but I really do want to move that conversation to, is it reflective? Not is it wrong, but is it reflective? Because we've had people saying, oh, it's too slow, my users are faster. We can now see that and see what the difference is. And also, Lighthouse is, and I'm using Lighthouse, but there's lots of other lab-based tools that do that, and lots of CI tools you can do that. It's also limited in some ways. It's fantastic and does a deep dive analysis of your page, but it can't capture anything, and particularly the responsive metrics and IMP that I'm sure we're going to talk about later aren't really captured in lab-based tools. So I think it's changed the conversation. I don't think we've all got there yet, or we've stopped having to do that. And then even then, when you get there, like Crux, I work on it. I think it's fantastic, but again, it's got limits too, because it's a public data set, and it can quite often tell you've got a problem, but to really understand what that problem is and be able to drill down and be able to fix that problem, you actually maybe need to go to a full rum solution beyond that, and not just depend on that, which again is getting much more popular, and there's a lot of great rum providers out there, but to me still feels like it's maybe not as niche as it was before, but it's still not that common to have a lot of these things. Saying that, there's a lot of free things. We have our own free Web Vitals library that we give out there to make it easier for people who can't afford a full rum solution to gather that sort of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think it's getting a lot more common, and I think we've definitely kicked ourselves along the path and along the journey there, but I don't think the journey's over by any means. I think there's still a ways to go for a lot of people and a lot of sites.
Absolutely. And that gets back to the sort of long-going campaign that I've had and I've talked about, which is the idea of performance literacy. I mean, I realize that performance is not the easiest, web performance specifically, is not the easiest to grasp overnight. It does take a little bit of time and quite honestly, a bit of experience as well. So you sort of have to, stick around and look at stuff. And, last night, I know the New York Web Performance Meetup, they had their Meet for Speed online. And who was there? Oh my God. But anyways, they talked about recognizing patterns. And these are the things that are going to happen once you've sort of like looked at performance sort of data on and on. I mean, shout outs to, not this. Oh, yeah, this is the comment. Great point. Core Vitals has brought everyone to the technical table. Thank you, Theo. I do appreciate that. But I do believe that's the case, because I think it took a while for people to really sort of understand and value performance. We're still not quite there yet, but we will get there.
But I think that's the other thing with these high-level metrics, and I don't think any of us will pretend they're perfect by any means, or the be-all and end-all. They're never going to evolve beyond that. But they are, even if you can't understand why your LCP is slow, as a high-level traffic light system of is my loading fast or not, they're reasonably easy to understand. Almost said evil there. That was a Freudian slip. So you get different people at the table. You get the CTOs and the CEOs and the marketing people who are coming up and saying this is important, whereas previously I think web performance was more, what's my DOM concept loaded time, what's my unload time, a very technical thing. So I think that's another good side of the program.
I want to get into Crux data since you brought that up. So for those who may or may not know, on a monthly basis, the Crux data is released, and Crux meaning Chrome User Experience Report. And they basically outline the 3 core vitals that we know. So LCP, CLS, FID, and then they also summarize it by sort of combining all those metrics and sort of like provide a score. Barry, did you want to sort of expand on that a bit so people know what Crux is and maybe even how to sort of follow that?
Yeah, so Crux is a Chrome User Experience Report. When you install Chrome, you get asked, are you happy to send anonymized data back to Google? Some people are more privacy conscious, will say no, but a lot of people say yes. Then as you're browsing the website, we are sending that back anonymous data. There's some other requirements. You have to be synced and logged in. It's all in the documentation exactly what it is. So it's only Chrome users, obviously, which also means we have a bit of a blind spot for iOS, where Chrome is really a wrapper around the Safari browser engine there. But saying that, Chrome is a very popular browser, so it gets an awful lot of traffic, and it's all the real users using that, feeding it back. We aggregate it up, and if you meet certain anonymity requirements, we will publish that data. We're currently publishing data for 16 million websites or of that order. If you have enough for URL, we'll show individual URLs, but for not all of them, we'll aggregate that up until we've got enough data to show that, which might be the origin level. I would say it's not released monthly. Says he who sends out the monthly release email. But Crux is updated daily, and you can see that through the Search Console shows the data, PageSpeed Insights will show the data there, and there's an API that gathers that data. And what that does is to try and remove a bit of noise and the variability is we gather the data over a 28-day rolling window and show we look at the 75th percentile, which basically means we knock off the 25% extreme values, the worst values there, and say, okay, everything beneath that is roughly 75% of users got that or better. And we show those numbers in these various tools and also these breakdowns. However, once a month, what we also do is we take a snapshot of that for the previous month. It's actually, between you and me, technically the last 28 days. So for months with more than 28 days, we actually are a couple of days short, which don't tell anyone that. So we just launched the May data. And we do a bit of an announcement on Twitter and in our release notes saying, here's what it is, here's the things that we change. And we try to give a bit of explanation. We see LCP has gone down across the board this month. This is for the following reasons, or sometimes we don't know the reasons. We try to look at it and try to give you a good answer. Sometimes it's just variability. We see a lot of change. December, for example, you often see a lot of change there because the way people use the internet changes a lot. I don't know, they're shopping more. Christian communities are taking the time off during that time, and so on. So yeah, there's a lot of change to that. And again, summer, people take time off and do that. So you do see some level of variability, which is always the fun with running data. But yeah, once a month, we kind of take a snapshot. We save that in a BigQuery database, not at the URL level, so that's only available at the origin level. And it's pretty easy to query. You can get a 1 terabyte free pass with Google Cloud to query that. And we also make it available in various dashboards on the HB Archive website, and lots of other tools put it in there, like Debug Bear and those sorts of things also make the data available there. So a lot of them grab that. But yeah, feel free to drop me any questions about Crux there on that. I see a couple of questions coming in. But yeah.
Yes, and I was actually just going to get to the first question that came in quite promptly, actually. So Eli G had asked, when will Crux RUM data take into account SPA, depending on what part of the country you're at, page transition. So, Michael, I was going to come to you, but, you gleefully, raised your hand to take this on. So it's all yours.
Cool. All right. So before I give a single word answer, I just want to walk through kind of the way we think of this. So any metric that we plan to expose or ship or measure, we want you to be able to measure yourself. So the first path, besides just doing research and trying to figure out what is it that we even want, is to figure out how can we expose this to the web, like through an API that might only be in Chrome, might be added to the web platform, might be standardized. And we have these web performance APIs through the Web Performance Working Group. And so the first part of this answer is we have engineers working on it right now, working on figuring out what is it that we want to specify, how do we want to expose it? And there is an origin trial available in Chrome where you could begin to measure navigations automatically. So the browser detects certain criteria that it thinks align with this SPA transition such that it is roughly equivalent to what the user would consider a normal navigation. It isn't an actual navigation from the browser's perspective. There's no new page loaded. It's just JavaScript changing on the page. There's some amount of URL change. There's some amount of DOM change. There's some amount of content being replaced. And when we detect these things, we will give you the timestamp of that change. We will also begin to reset certain metrics that the browser is measuring. For example, you'll get a new set of LCP element entries. You might get a new first input event, that sort of thing. A lot of the performance APIs already report for the whole page lifecycle. So like I work on interaction to next paint. Well, that's built on top of the event timing API, which already reports for the full page lifecycle. You can already slice your page according to routes. So the first part of that answer is if you're doing your own RUM measurement, you can already do a lot of this type of slicing because of just the way the performance APIs work, and specifically this new origin trial, which I'd just like to shout out to give it a chance, see it if it aligns with your own site's measurement and the way you think of SPA transitions for your particular site. You could also just do so in local testing, of course. Second is exactly right. The question asks, when will this be exposed to Crux RUM data? So at some point, we get to the point where we're pretty happy with that metric, and we might ship some sort of set of experimental metrics to the Crux user report. So if anybody remembers, interaction to next paint started as an experimental responsiveness metric that at some point was added to Crux many, many months before we even came up with a name of interaction to next paint. There was a lot more iteration that went into it. And so that would be the next step. And I would say that we are months away from there, but there are folks working behind the scenes towards that goal ultimately, because we agree that it would be great to have that information. There's a lot of interesting questions around that data, though. Both exactly how do you define some of these metrics after an SPA transition, and also just in what form do you want this exposed? And not everybody will have the same answers. And so, it takes a while to get these things quite right. And eventually when the dust settles, then we can think about what does that mean for the the program at large, vitals at large, that sort of thing. And that would be a longer journey, of course. So I don't have a specific timeline, but I think this year is a very exciting year. A lot of the groundwork, the foundations are being laid. So if you're going to grumble about the decisions made, now's the time to change the results of those early foundations. So it's a perfect time for feedback.
I would echo that last point massively. We can't go live until we know it works, and we need your feedback to try it out. There's an origin trial. Origin trials are very easy to do. We're begging for feedback here to say, hey, this works great, this is exactly what I want, release it, release it, release it, or no, this doesn't work for my website. Because it uses some heuristics, as Michael said, to try and work out whether a page transition on an SPA has actually happened or not. They may be wrong, they may be right, they may need to tweak, they may work for some websites, not for other websites. So we really need all the feedback we can get to say, yeah, it's good to go, or no, it's not.
So since this question started with a conversation around Crux, and we have mentioned INP. Here's a good question, maybe for you, Barry. Why is the Crux report that comes out apparently not monthly, not giving us an INP score? Because we're still getting CLS, CLS, FID, and LCP, and then we have all, but you do not have INP there.
That's fair enough, potentially. Given that what we've said about INP and about it being, it's going to be migrating to, for those that missed it, to a full core web vital. It's going to hopefully replace FID in March 2024. I think that's a fair point. We should probably give it a bigger notice. So I can take that on board, and we can start adding that in from next month. We've got the data there; it's available. So I'm happy to take that on and measure INP and how it's changing.
INP is in Crux.
It is, because I know it comes up, like, so over at webpage says we do sort of pull it up. I was just more alluding to the report that comes out sort of not monthly, and again, I go through it like when it comes out, and I'm like, okay, cool, and I'm checking patterns, but knowing that for the last year was like experimental, and it's kind of like play with it as you choose, and we're going to sort of like see how things go. And then obviously with the announcement last month and the month before, that it's sort of like in final stages, but yet it's still not really sort of being released on that report that comes out. And again, I'm not putting anyone on the spot here. I was just kind of curious as to why that wasn't happening.
No, I mean, all the data is released, but we do call out the 3 core web vitals. It's not quite a core web vital yet, but I think it's been announced that it's going to be. So, yeah, I think that's a fair point that we can I can add that to the monthly report that comes out.
Yeah. I use so many different data sources, I get mixed up, but I typically use the materialized Chrome UX report table. Rather than using the automated documentation that gets sent out monthly. And so in the monthly Chrome UX report table, there is INP. And so it's still a monthly or not quite monthly, but you have to explicitly sort of call it out, as opposed to the daily API, which would be constrained to specific origins.
Cool.
No, but as you say, given the that's where we kind of try and summarize what's happened in the last month and give explanations if they've gone up or down. I think it's a fair shout out to say we should include an INP in
that. Did I just open up an issue live?
Feature request.
Did I just resolve an issue live, or at least claim I'm going to?
Awesome. So there was another question here. Let me see. Great point. Oh, okay. I don't know who wants to tackle this one. When you get to questions, can you provide tips on how to optimize GA, GTM, and ad scripts? Does anyone want to tackle that? With respect to core vitals, I would imagine.
Yeah, we do a lot of testing, tracing, evaluating of our metrics. We look at a lot of real sites to sort of reverse engineer to see if we're meeting expectations. And these things do come up, and we've learned a lot over time. I would say, I don't have one silver bullet for you. One thing that we are often seeing is things like Google Tag Manager. It's not the GTM, it's the tags that you include, right? And so it's the same as JavaScript and the size of your JavaScript payload. It's not so much that, it's what you put in. And so I think that there is a bit of an industry issue where you see the value of adding something to your pages, right? There's some enticed marketing add this tag, add this script, you get this feature. So that's the value. But what is the cost? And it has been harder to evaluate. And so a lot of folks are not doing rigorous A/B testing. After adding this tag, how did my metrics move? Is that a reasonable trade-off? One wild example, we've seen certain types of scripts that try to measure conversions in interactions. So this particular interaction is so important that we want to measure it very, very accurately. But the act of measurement is ruining the conversion event, and so I understand how valuable the measurement is, but is it really worth losing users down that funnel? And so is that even well understood by these particular folks who are adding these things? Or are those trade-offs understood? So there is no silver bullet. It is very complicated.
I've got a few more things to add on this. So GA, I presume, is Google Analytics. That generally tends not to be too bad. We don't see that appearing up that. So if you are seeing that as a pause, now we've also got to be aware if you're putting these things into PageSpeed Insights and Lighthouse is saying this amount of JavaScript is not being used, you've got to be aware that maybe some of that is activated on click or as you change pages or on those things. So that's a best efforts guide. Take it with a bit of salt. Understand and pinch of salt. Understand what it's saying and saying no. GA is used, and I'm not saying GA is the most perfectly optimized library and it's not too large, and particularly GA4. But anyway, but yeah, don't assume that just because some of those audits flag that definitely means there's a problem. GTM, Google Tag Manager, can be fun and games, and by default it isn't too large. It's about 60K or something last time I looked. Not small by any means, but it generally doesn't cause problems. What tends to happen is whenever people fill it up with rubbish, and a lot of that, not rubbish, very important targeting things, blah, 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 blah. So you've got to understand that the GTM is a bucket, and what you put in that bucket is going to be directly reflected on your website. So if you've got tags from last summer or 1,000,001 tags or really bad JavaScript in there, quite often that will show up because it's downloaded as the Google Tag Manager script before it starts calling other things. It will quite often show up as Google Tag Manager, and it's like, oh, Google's at fault there. That's not to say Google Tag Manager is perfect and it can do that, but have a look what's in there and see what's there. And I often hear developers saying, oh, I don't have access to that. That's marketing's responsibility. They manage it or something like that. And I would strongly encourage people to look at that and see what we can do to trim it down. We've got a lot of great advice on web.dev about how to manage tag managers in the best way and stuff like that. Ads definitely are more complicated. They are quite intensive. It's quite. We've had a lot of internal conversations about ads and what they do, and it's quite impressive in some ways that they even work. There's a lot going on there to get those ads on the pages. And yeah, I don't have, to Michael's point, I don't have a silver bullet on those things. Obviously, 600 ads on the page is going to be more difficult than one ad on the page, but there's obviously good revenue things that you need to consider there. I will say we are reaching out to ad partners and we are talking to them and we are trying to look to see what we can do in the Chrome side with that. Your side, the typical sorts of stories of delaying those sorts of things that are, maybe not as important as the content until it comes first, and making sure that you're waiting until the page load itself has died down can often help with those sorts of things.
I have to apologize. They're mowing the lawn behind me.
Wondered who that was.
I was like, can you hear it?
I thought you were downtown.
Well, I have grass, believe me. Hold on a second. Oh my God. Okay. So before I get to the next question, and Casey, I see you. Michael mentioned conversions, and I happened to be on a call yesterday talking about conversions specifically, and with respect to at one point core vitals and how they can obviously ameliorate your conversions if you sort of look after them. Out of the potentially the four that we know of the core vitals, which one do you feel might potentially contribute to the best sort of like boosting conversions as they stand right now?
So this is a super interesting question that I've looked at a lot, and I think there's lots of different factors that play into it. I think it's easiest to measure the correlation with LCP because the user intent is much clearer, right? We know that the user loaded a page and that they were trying to do something, and that LCP is just a block in there. Whereas if you try to do a correlation analysis with IMP or CLS, we actually have one internally where somebody was looking at different types of shopping websites, and they found that print like custom printing was IMP was slower for the conversions, and when they looked into it, they found that like you hit preview and it's this like super clunky UI that previews what you're going to print. But if you've gotten to the point in your conversion rate where you hit preview, then you're going to buy it. And so it's not that slow IMP makes you convert, it's that converting makes your IMP slower. And we do believe that if that site had fixed their IMP then and made it better, then they would have better conversions. But we can't show with the same types of studies that we can with LCP. So it's a lot harder to understand. And what we're doing in lieu of that is we're doing a lot of partner studies. We put up ones with Economic Times and Redbus where they had like really great business improvements after they improved their IMP.
There was another study that I think taught me a lot. I forget the specific partner that was the example. Maybe they shouldn't get named anyway, but they made a significant improvement to IMP, and they were A/B testing before and after to capture the thing. And there wasn't as much of a correlation with the conversion event itself, for a couple of reasons. Perhaps the reason Annie mentioned, where the folks who do convert tend to get further in the funnel, which means more interactions, which means a greater chance to capture a long IMP. But what they did see was the size of the basket, like the value of those conversions, went up significantly. So what was happening was there's some campaign and inbound traffic for a particular item in the store. If you've made it there, you've searched for that thing you're interested in, you've landed on that campaign, you've gone to the checkout, whatever, or added it to your cart. Like the funnel to drop off, it's more likely to be UX issues rather than performance issues at that point. But if the performance is not great, you might not be tempted to stick around and browse around, do a bit of window shopping. But if it's snappy and elegant, then you're going to sort of look around and maybe upsell to those other things. And the size of that difference was so much more significant than we were expecting. So that was like an interesting lesson for us, I think.
Another thing is that IMP can catch some of those error conditions. We've seen this happens to me for some reason on hotel checkouts a lot, where I start typing and it's doing some like over validation, and like every letter it validates all the field forms and it just like crunches and you can barely type. And so IMP catches a lot of things that are like kind of bounding on errors. So I would definitely check your checkout pages IMP.
Excellent for all you e-com and online retailers out there who might be tuning in. Obviously, IMP is going to be important, but certainly on the immediate sort of solution, LCP seems to be one that is providing some of that conversion boost that will fatten your pockets, as we'll say. Let's get into a question here from Casey. Let me see. Are there plans to reveal the element targets associated with poor performing, INP values in Crux page or page speed? This would help with debugging and prioritizing work to improve INP. Who wants to tackle this one?
I'll take that one. I will say Crux is a public data set, so we are limited in what we can and or certainly are comfortable making available there. Similar to the way that we don't make all sites available, or you have to meet a certain anonymity threshold. Data like particularly which buttons people are clicking or what fields they're filling in and stuff like that really is something that I think even site owners wouldn't be comfortable with us exposing to the rest of the world. Because again, there's also a competitive thing of the great thing about Crux is you can go and see exactly what your competitors' core web vital scores are. The bad thing about Crux is if we put a lot of data in there, you can go and get a lot of competitor information by going to Crux. So I don't think that data will ever appear in Crux to that level of data. Saying that, we've had a lot of discussions about how we can help people more and give data that we are comfortable and that is easier to aggregate up. Like in PageSpeed Insight and Lighthouse recently, we show the Lighthouse breakdown. Actually, sorry, I don't think it's quite made it into PageSpeed Insight yet, but it is in Lighthouse. So we show the LCP breakdown bits, so we can say, is it because the document's slow? Is it because it's an image and it takes a long time to download, or is it because of that? So the 4 bits that we recommend measuring in LCP. Similarly, we started measuring in the Web Vitals extension the 3 parts that make up INP, the sort of delay before you even start processing because something else is on the main thread, the actual processing itself, or the paints that have to happen because of that processing. Those are things that we could potentially expose in maybe not, that's more difficult to put in Lighthouse because you need an interaction to do that, but potentially at some point in the future, maybe those are the sorts of things that we could put in Crux to try and help people say, hey, it's all just delay. It's not, it's just too much JavaScript, or it's all rendering stuff. Oh, I hadn't even looked at that sort of stuff. I'd been too busy looking at optimizing my JavaScript, but didn't realize that my framework was re-rendering the entire page, and that was the problem, and I need to try and limit that. So yes, we're certainly interested in talking about what we can do there. I don't think there's anything super soon coming for that sort of thing, but it is something we've already started talking about. But to the level of detail of this element or this button, that won't ever be available in Crux for those reasons. And again, I strongly encourage people to get that sort of thing from their own RUM solution and say there's free libraries that do it. We have one. There's lots of great RUM products that make it easier to see there and do that. But that really does make debugging this sort of stuff a lot easier. And you can go in there and see not just what page is a bad INP, but you can actually say, hey, it's all people clicking on the checkout button, as opposed to I've been looking at the add to basket button. I didn't realize this. I've been looking in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Andre, you're still muted. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I think someone else wanted to chime in on this, or both of you. I saw some hands go up.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to echo what Barry said, especially about we have a reference implementation in webvitals.js. So pretty much any solution you're using, you can use that to collect the data yourself. And about the privacy aspects, our playtime link doesn't actually even allow us to collect anything but numbers for privacy reasons. So if you're thinking about suggesting features to Crux, it's something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
Yeah, I wanted, if we have the time, just to take a step back. The bigger question was asking about making it easier to debug INP with the specific suggestion of exposing element targets in Crux. So that feature cannot land. There's some alternatives. So I agree with everything that was said. In terms of INP metric, I think early feedback we got was that it's a very complicated metric. It's one of the harder metrics. It's certainly very difficult to get right, which I think is a bit unfortunate because I don't think it is as complicated as it's made out to be. So I kind of have a waterfall of things that need to happen to improve the situation, right? So I actually think INP is a very easy metric to understand, but you do need a little bit of hands-on experience with it. And so we've done a lot recently to make it easier to measure locally, both making changes to dev tools, to tracing, to default performance profiles. We updated the core, the Web Vitals Chrome extension that you can install with like default console logs with a bit of thing. We're working on documentation updates. There's a whole bunch of streams on that, some workshops, like a bunch of easy ways to literally go out and play. And I think an hour of play with this metric will answer all those hypothetical questions, and we'll all have a bit more intuitive grasp. And that starts to get to the topic that Barry was talking about, where the latency of a specific interaction, which ultimately is what we put into the INP score, is not just JavaScript that's running. It is good old-fashioned input delay. It is the time you spend running your event handlers, or third-party scripts are running event handlers. It is the work that gets automatically scheduled right after event handlers, perhaps by frameworks automatically, perhaps by other code that's running on your page. It is the time it takes the browser to render all of those updates that you made. And then finally, the browser still has to convert those rendering instructions into actual literal pixels to show the user. And there are so many different web platform features that can affect any number of those stages. So I think Barry makes some good points that we will try for your particular origin or URL to tell you which of those buckets you might not be aware of has the most focus. I think most folks won't be surprised to learn that it's very often just JavaScript, just in event handlers. But when it's not that low-hanging fruit, it can be surprising where these other costs come from. You know, you can add one line of CSS to a page and tank it. You can add one line for loop into a templating engine and spit out a whole bunch of DOM that you weren't expecting with a much deeper thing. And then all of a sudden rendering gets slow. There's a whole bunch of things like that. Now, when it comes to doing automatic lab testing, there's a bunch of features coming down the pipe, but that is harder because automating interactions is not a thing that has been that common. I think tooling plays a role here. I think this will be the longest part of the journey overall. But in terms of turning existing field data, existing RUM metrics, actually measuring interactions, and then grabbing insights out of those interactions to summarize almost like a burn down list. Hey, on your origin, this one interaction affects half your users, and here's the reason, and here's the element, and here's the timing. Here's this little journey that you should try in the lab so that you can make changes. I think a lot of folks are playing in this space, so this should be the next big win. We're seeing a lot of RUM providers adopt IMP to measure it. We're seeing them play with Pending Beacon API to measure more of page lifecycle, and then turn their UI features to help developers understand what was happening. And then, of course, the Web Vitals library and stuff you could measure yourself. So I'm really excited here. I think this will take years to make it as simple as like, here's the answer sheet. But I love the narrowing of focus. And so I think it's going to be easier than ever very soon. So I'm just very, very excited about it. And then, of course, whether you can actually fix your IMP might be easy, might be very hard. And so if that's when you say IMP is hard because your pages are complicated and it's hard to fix, I understand. But at least it should be easy to measure, to intuit what is happening, and then make decisions about whether you're going to, you know, make those trade-offs or whatever. But I think we're still in that transition phase of making it at least understandable. So I'm very excited.
So once upon a time, not so long ago, it was sort of deemed sort of a common knowledge that the LCP was, or largest contentful paint, was one of the more complicated, if not the most complicated, of the metrics to solve. Two-part question. Is IMP going to be the new metric to be hardest to sort of like sort of fix? And really, that should be the second question. But the first question, and I feel like we should probably start to tackle it now, could we even talk about the origin of the IMP, how it sort of came about and where it stands today? And I'm going to sort of presume, Michael, you're going to take this on?
Can I just answer the easier question?
Certainly.
Actually, IMP, we're seeing LCP is still the most difficult metric, even with IMP in the score there.
Okay.
If you look at the IMP results come in there, they've got a higher pass rate than LCP. That's, you know, there's a lot of static websites, blogs of websites that are pulling up the tier there compared to things. But yeah, LCP is still the most difficult. So when we hear about IMP being difficult to manage and that sort of stuff, LCP is still the one. And I don't think it's the most complicated one. I think it's probably the most understood one, but it's the most difficult one that the sites don't get right. So that's the easy question answered. Michael can now take the hard one.
Yeah, I will say INP has the largest range, like Barry mentioned. There's some static sites and desktop sites that are bringing it up. But if you're a very popular, very heavy, very interactive site targeting mobile users, which is where everyone wants to be, that's the sweet spot. INP it's tough at the moment. It shouldn't be, right? The threshold of 200 milliseconds is well above the established UX patterns. So we gave you kind of we settled on a realistic target that is achievable in the slew of types of devices that are out there. But that means that higher end devices should be doing better than what we've set as the target. And yet it's still doing very poorly for a bunch of reasons. So I think we're seeing rapid improvements in these pass rates, again, partially because of improvements we're making, partially because of drawing attention to this, and a lot of folks are thinking. And the web is gradually improving in this space. I think some of this is correlation. So to the I remember the question about difficulty, but I can't.
Basically, I was asking if you want to sort of talk
The
about
origins,
the journey of like the origin of IMP
Yeah.
to present day.
I mean, I would say that measuring interactions feels like a very common sense metric. I think it's not surprising we didn't stumble upon it with an epiphany overnight or anything like that. I think it really comes down to we had first input delay as a responsiveness metric. At the time when first input delay was developed, there was a lot of early loading script that was kind of naive. It was just loading when it loads and executing when it executes, and it was blocking the main thread and that sort of thing. It wasn't very coordinated. It wasn't very sophisticated. And so that was the biggest problem out there for responsiveness. And so once a page settled in and it kind of finished loading, most interactions were still relatively quick. But what we see with big frameworks developing a lot of pages these days, you see this sophisticated coordination of JavaScript and UI. You see complicated task schedulers. So what ended up happening is there's all this work that needs to happen before an interaction can actually be handled by what the developer considers their own code or their own event handlers. And all these rich browser features, all these CSS effects, animations, etc., where you could have a huge DOM update interactively with crazy effects that can actually take a very long time to get rendered. So what was once a problem, input delay, from a browser's perspective, like the browser couldn't even give the event to the web page. Now you have the web page accepts that input event really quickly, but it schedules it at the back of its own internal task scheduling event loop. And it takes a lot more rendering before it can get a chance to actually reflect those changes, update that state, do a re-render. Or maybe the page was updated quickly, but the browser still had to do so much work because of these expensive APIs. And so all we wanted to do is to say, the whole goal of these vitals is to measure what the user saw. That's the reason why LCP is such a good loading metric. It's the reason why CLS is measured, because it's what the user saw. It doesn't matter what technology stack you used. And so what was the right way to measure interactions? How do you even define interactions in the way that users think about them? We tried really hard and it became more complicated, specifically because we wanted a user that clicks on the page 3 times is going to get 3 values. It would have been easier to do the more complicated under the hood type thing. And what they will see is exactly how much time they would have measured if they used the stopwatch. I'm going to click here. I'm going to measure with a stopwatch. This is where I saw the result. I clicked the stopwatch off. And that's what we're measuring. So it's not an internal value. It's not just input delay. It's not just the time spending running JavaScript. None of those things matter to the user. But it takes years to build that infrastructure to get it right, and we continue to improve. But that's the reason. I don't think it's rocket science. It's just a lot of hard engineering. Henri, mute.
I'm sorry. I'm just so scared that this, the groundskeepers will just pass by with the lawnmower again. So it'll be kind of wild. So what I was going to say is, so I guess this was the onus to sort of like get IMP sort of set up, just because, like you said, the way essentially the modern web was kind of like happening, and there's more than just like an initial load and okay, let's measure is what was happening. Anyways, something else that came to mind, and this is for you actually, Annie, because I've seen a few of your talks, and I'm trying to remember the quote, but it had something to do with 90% of the work or interaction was happening after the first load. Maybe I got this wrong.
So we just looked at like the time spent on the web and how much of that is like while the page is loading. 90% of the user time on the median web page is after the page is loaded. And it's a little bit scary if you think about like all of our tooling and all of our focus. Yes, we have this great correlation between LCP and conversion rates, but we're not looking at the 90% of what users are doing hardly at all. And, IMP and CLS are trying to look at that, but, and there's great questions about single page apps that included in the 90%, right? I think we really need to work hard as an industry to get a broader picture. And it's not just in performance, right? Like accessibility is something where you could have big changes after the page load, for example.
Okay. I want to tackle this question that came in, and I feel like we touched on it very briefly in the beginning. Essentially, with regards to iOS and Safari, or iOS period. Seed core vitals are great, but can be a big blind spot on iOS. Is there more standards work happening here for cross-browser adoption?
Yeah, so I'll take this. We work on all our standards in the web performance working group, and we work really hard to take feedback from other vendors, and we would love to do anything we can to get more adoption. Mozilla is working on an LCP implementation, and they have an event timing implementation, so that's like really exciting for us. And the thing that I would tell anybody here that really wants to see this in Safari is to tell Apple that they really listen to web developers a lot more than they listen to us. I think you all have more power than you know. Just not just for talking to Apple, but when you say like, "Hey, I'm trying to load this third party and they're slow," like go tell them. Go tell the things that you're using what you'd like to see.
Awesome.
I would make, sorry if I can, a couple of
means.
extra points on that. One is, even if, let's be optimistic, when they implement that, that obviously won't feed back to the Chrome user experience report. So it would be great to have the API so that you can measure it yourself, or your RUM provider can measure that sort of stuff. But it will still be somewhat missing, and that won't be able to go to Crux, because I don't see Apple agreeing to send us anonymous data or something like that. So there will still be a bit of a blind spot. I would say, though, that in general, iOS users tend to be at the higher end of they've faster devices. They're typically in places with faster networks and stuff like that. So in a way, I'd be more concerned if it was the other way around and we were only measuring iOS devices and not Androids, because you see a lot of Android people struggling, or the cheaper Android phones are really struggling with performance. And yes, it's slightly biased that it isn't being offset by some of those nice fancy iPhone users, but in a way, actually, I think that's quite good, because it's highlighting a spotlight on the users that need our help the most. So it is quite good in that sense, and we're lucky in that sense that it's at least highlighting the right sensor, or giving a bias to the right sensor in my mind.
Yes, super important. It's funny. I was looking at Akamai's ROM archive actually, and it's kind of like a 40-60 split in terms of iPhone and Android from their perspective. But I mean, which is good to know, because Akamai
it's 40, but it really changes. It's a 40-50 split in the US, or sorry, 60 even iOS in the US, 40 Android. You go over somewhere like India or Malaysia, and it's like 95% Android, and it's not the latest Pixel 8 super duper hardware there. It is the much lower brand, or much lower ones, which is equivalent of our 5 or 10 years phone. That's prevalent in those areas. So there is a big disparity depending on where in the world you are.
Absolutely. And that was just like sort of like their entire network. And, I didn't break it down by geos, but I absolutely agree. I remember, reading once upon a time that, one of the challenges with Androids is that they almost never sort of like fell off the network, right? They would just always get passed down to kids, and then they would pass them down to other kids and whatever, or other people, and then they were constantly like present, and that was always like a challenge to look at. Yes, Barry.
Well, I think that happens with iPhones as well. Like they're both great products. I'm not going to sit there and insult them. I'm an iPhone user myself. Probably shouldn't admit that, but anyway. There's lots of iPhone users in Google and stuff like that. But I think it's more the market they're aiming for. Apple tends to go for the premium sort of end of the market. The expensive Android tends to go across the whole market. So it's not an insult to Apple to say they're only looking at rich people, or Android to say they're producing poor phones. They're not. They're producing the appropriate phones for the various levels of market. There's some great Android phones out there, and there's some very cheap Android phones out there which have to make certain compromises to keep them cheap and make them available to people.
I'm sorry, the lawnmower is right there. Okay. Quickly, obviously we talked about AMP, a lot of things that are involved there. In terms of like more recent changes, I feel like LCP is one metric that went through a few changes. Does anyone want to sort of tackle that and explain how that's sort of like uh, the effect that it's had moving forward?
Yeah, we continually get developer feedback about things that people find frustrating about LCP, and I think the thing to know is it takes a really long time to like come up with, like okay, what are we going to do with this, and then evaluate it. Like we look at film strips and stuff like that, but we also run live experiments to see how it changes, and then to evaluate the data. And then at the end, a lot of the time, those changes end up not to be really big deal, right? Like that we made a change to LCP, and it just doesn't affect most people. But we are really trying to keep up with feedback and understand like where the blind spots are.
And what's been a like more recently, what's been some of the feedback that you've heard from developers?
Yeah, we've gotten some feedback around especially animated GIFs and videos that it would be great if we measure the first frame. So we have a change in late experimentation that hopefully we'll be able to do that. And then we've gotten a lot of questions around placeholders and transparent images and like whether those should be LCP. And so we made some changes to the metric to try and make it clear that like the actual main content should be the LCP.
One recent one. There are some heuristics just to make it as useful of a metric as possible. So for example, like background images were not considered contentful. It is an image, it does load, it is background, but it comes out, the web is evolving, and there are a lot of these like TikTok style experiences where it's a full bleed image. And so in some cases, the primary content is 100% viewport, and it could be implemented as a background image. And so now all of a sudden, the types of sites we saw when we calibrated the metric at first, that the web is evolving, and so you might have to reevaluate or something. So that's another example.
Nothing like making some edits to satisfy TikTok users, so they're always a lot of fun. So
I think Instagram actually, I think, was it? I don't know if it was TikTok. Anyway, similar sort of thing.
It's all the same. It's all the same. What was I going to say? Yeah. So covered IMP, covered LCP. Is there anything that's been happening, say, on the CLS and or what's left? CLS, FID. Well, FID. Let's not even talk about that. Let's say on the CLS side.
CLS has been relatively stable. So we did the big change last year when we moved to the windowing thing. So we didn't just have it continually growing. I think from what I'm hearing when I speak to people is there's still confusion between Lighthouse says I have no CLS, Crux says I have CLS. So we just updated our guidance on that, and we kind of split it into two of load CLS, which Lighthouse is really good at spotting and will tell you exactly what the problems are, and post-load CLS, which is you're scrolling down the page, you get some lazy loaded images, you haven't given them dimensions, they cause some shifts and those sorts of things. So a lot of people like to say, hey, Lighthouse is right because it says 0. They're optimistic. They always go for the better number, strangely enough. But that I'd say is the main sort of thing we're seeing. There is some other annoyances with animated content and whether it should count towards CLS is causing us some noise and some pain there. And you can argue from like there's ways of making it animated in a different way that's in effect the same to the user, but that's not really the intent of the metric. So whether that should be measured it is certain very specific scenarios, so it's not a huge priority, but that's definitely causing some confusion and noise. But in general, I'd say CLS is more compared to LCP, where we're still trying to fix some of these things and change things, and IMP, which is definitely changing. I'd say LCP is the more stable of the three metrics or 3 or 4 metrics. Annie, I don't know if you've got any other comments on
that. Yeah, nothing more to add on CLS. Michael?
I think maybe you just covered it, Barry, but I would, it's unexpected layout shifts that are the problem. And so that word unexpected has nuance. And so there have been cases where there are shifts which do shift layout, but where the site owner says, yeah, but I want that. That is my intention. That's not, blame those other folks. I'm okay, you know. And so there's always nuance there. On the other hand, there are certain experiences with a page where a page might be not pleasant to use, that, like, you know, the content itself, while not technically shifting, is not doing the right things. And so it's unexpectedly jittery or not smooth, or certain types of anti-patterns that are causing UX issues, but that we don't consider layout shifts, right? And so the question is also, you know, where do we draw the line? You know, how do we have the best results? And so there's other types of UX issues that are in spirit similar to CLS, but are not really CLS, you know, like interstitials popping up or whatever it is. And so that sometimes comes up as feedback as well.
Interstitials. I almost forgot about those. They tend to always come up at the worst time. You know, it's like, oh, I want to look at this. Interstitial. I got caught in a trap. Cool. Well, I feel like we've covered what's going on in terms of like modern moments of Core Web Vitals. Oh my God, what is going on back there? And so I was going to say, do we have closing statements before we wrap this up? I'll start with you, Barry.
No, I guess my big shout out to people would be to come talk to us, give us feedback. When we started talking about the SoftNav's origin trial, so that's the sort of thing that we want feedback for. IMP, we want people to say, this is great, this works, or this is really horrible to debug, or it would be great if you could do X, Y, or Z. No question is too silly or stupid to be considered. Some of them are going to be no, like, can we put it in Crux, the element? I'd love to, but no, for the reasons given. But, you know, we don't have all the answers. So the more we can hear from the community and what's working and what's not, the better we can do. And if there's, say, I particularly look after the docs, so we'll continue to update on that. If something is confusing or can be read in two ways and you're not sure what the right way is, or you want an example or whatever, come speak to myself or Jeremy or Rick or Brendan, and we'll update the docs there on that. Awesome. And where can they find you best? Because I know there are too many outlets now. Yeah, I'm still hanging around Twitter. I'm waiting there until it's dying days. I am available on some of the other ones like Mastodon and Blue Sky, but I'll be honest, I'm only tweaking in and out there. That's probably the best. LinkedIn, I don't check that often, so try your best not to do that. But you can usually find me hanging around Twitter or, I say, Web Performance Stack. A lot of people on there I know, and I'm quite lucky to travel around and see a lot of people in conferences. So never feel afraid to come up and say hi. Awesome. And yourself, Annie, any closing statements?
Definitely want to echo what Barry said. We do have a mailing list, Web Vitals feedback, like web-vitals-feedback at googlegroups.com. And that's like our official channel. So that's super helpful if people send feedback there. And then also, like I said before, if someone else is causing you a problem, send them feedback too. We have seen actually people make changes in response to developer feedback.
And where can we find you?
Annie Sully on Twitter and LinkedIn.
All right, Michael, you have the honors of taking this baton on the anchor leg.
Close the floor.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity today. So there's that. I'm really hoping nobody busts in with a chainsaw behind you, you know, breaks through that door. So I don't know what the noise is. I'm nice and easy to find. MMOCNY in all the places. You can even just email me at Google, at Gmail, on Twitter. There it is. And that's it.
And in terms of closing statements, something you're looking forward to seeing?
I mean, I am really heads down on IMP. I think that this next year is going to be an exciting one, both with the launch of adoption for Core Web Vital, which was announced for next year, but also, you know, when everybody aligns along one single metric so powerfully, magic happens. You know, we're finding all sorts of very neat opportunities to make improvements to the core engine within Chrome. There are a bunch of scheduling changes coming. There's a bunch of tooling changes coming to really highlight interactions. And I think that, you know, every developer, even someone who's just starting out in performance, measuring interactions is such a core phenomenon that it should be really, really easy with nice little breakdowns. What did you interact with? where did the time go in nice little time slices. I love the network panel. It can be overwhelming, but I think a lot of folks look at that waterfall and they understand the cost from the server, the cost for the resource fetch, the cost for processing the resource. I think we need something like that, like an interactions waterfall that gives you all those details. And so, there's lots to do, and it'll be just like, super excited. That's where I'm at.
Awesome. Well, I definitely do want to thank everyone for taking the time to, answer some of these questions and have this discussion. I certainly do want to have a few more of these because I think they're absolutely insightful. As I mentioned earlier, there's nothing better than web performance literacy because things are like the skies open up. That's the way I look at it. Things are a lot clearer, and you know where to make some of these these debugging efforts, as was mentioned earlier. Eli, thank you very much for joining in. Very kind words of yours. Let me see if I could just pop those in. I think it's really important to sort of share some of this wealth of knowledge so that people can have or are able to provide better experiences. Everyone else that tuned in, thank you very much for tuning in. Again, this was a bit of a slight reboot for the Toronto Web Performance group. I've been meaning to do this, obviously looking to get this done in person for those in Toronto. But I do value the idea of being able to sort of like combine a lot of great minds. Like in this moment right here, we have Barry, who's in the UK, Michael, who's in not Toronto, but 3 hours away, and Annie, who's in the great state of Michigan.
Ireland left the UK about 100 years ago. There was a bit of a tiff about that in the family heard.
Did I say close to the UK or in the UK?
I thought you said in the UK.
Oh, I thought I said close, but I don't know. I'll have to go check the tape. Either way, if I did say in the UK, that's the last time you hear it because I'll edit that real quick. But everyone, thank you very much. We're going to have this edited probably by Monday. I might even chop it up to make these little comestible little tidbits that people can share as well. So that being said, merci, folks. Thank you. And we'll catch everyone very soon. I do have some more ideas coming up for a stream. Cheers.
Thanks, Henri. Thanks, everyone.
Au revoir.
Bye. And